So without any more ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Rodley, who's going to be, not quite sure what the expression is, whether it's chairing, adjudicating, or just gently pointing things in the right direction. But anyway, please welcome Chris Rodley.
As probably a lot of you will be aware, you would have had to have been off the planet to not have been aware of some of the media circus around the film and tonight's guests. It became apparent to me the current wave on Monday. Some of you may have missed it when our beloved, bejumpered TV film critic Barry Norman announced that every film festival needs its scandal, and that Crash was certainly that, and that beyond that, the movie was indeed in places repellent. He didn't follow that statement with his usual obligatory qualifier, and why not? But then on Friday, the Telegraph announced that this depraved film was in fact getting distribution in this country, and pointed out that I believe the vice chairman of Time Warner, Mr. Ted Turner, who you probably all know, had suddenly become aware that one of the independent companies that Time Warner had gobbled up, as they tend to do, mainline cinema, was intending to release the film in the States. I didn't know, but he, in that piece, wanted to make it clear that that decision was made above his head, and that he thought the film was appalling, and he was very worried about what teenagers might think of it and might do when they saw it. All of this from the man who married Barbarella, of course, but anyway. And then it all began. I mean, since then, we've had, of course, lots of radio, national news on all channels, and apparently, at the last minute, some machinations at the Home Office to try and actually reconsider whether the film should have even been shown here last night, which it was, thank God. In this country, it all began, of course, you may remember, back in June 6th, when the London Evening Standard dedicated an entire page to an excoriating attack on the film and everyone involved in it, as far as I remember, by senior film critic Alexander Walker. That piece was keen to stress to us, lest we should have forgotten, that to be a victim of a car crash was not sexy. And many articles since then have stressed that similar thing. This leads me to wonder if certain critics, and certainly maybe all censors and would-be censors, and even some politicians probably, seem to demonstrate that they have something very much in common with true psychotics, which is that they are seriously unable to differentiate between fantasy and reality, or between an imagined life or an imaginary life and a real life. If that's true, of course, then maybe certain film critics and certain politicians and all censors could be more dangerous than we might have thought, and perhaps society would be a safer and happier place if we locked them up instead of the kind of people who make movies like Crash. I'm convinced myself that most of those people are a good deal more dangerous than our two guests this evening. So if you could put your plaster cast together for, in strict alphabetical order, the writer of the novel Crash, Mr. J.G. Ballard, and the producer, director, and writer of the screenplay of the movie, Mr. David Cronenberg.
Well, I thought you were going to do the first 20 minutes yourself. That would have been great. And what do we have here? Okay, Badham. That's good. Well, now that Chris has discussed the press, I would really like for us not to mention them one more time tonight. It would be great.
Don't take that away from me.
But I think I'd like to just start by asking Jim a question. And someone who was talking to me about the film said, you know, why didn't you call the main character in the movie David Cronenberg? Because that would have been the true equivalent of Ballard calling the main character in the book James Ballard. And I said, you know, it actually had never occurred to me, but in a way you're right. I'm not sure what that would have done to the film. Now, I'd just like to ask you what you would have thought if you'd gotten the script and it had said that.
No, I think you should have done. Now, if only you'd consulted me on the script, you see, I would have been a big help there.
Well, I did
get... Great movie makers, I've noticed, and I've worked with two, don't tend to pay any attention to the authors of the original material. But this is one case, David, where you missed out on immortality.
Oh, God.
But you achieved it everywhere else, because I'd just like to begin by saying what a brilliant film it is. I mean, it's an extraordinary film that I think people will realize, you know, is a landmark movie in every respect.
Thank you.
I mean,
Thank you.
I think it's much more original than even you probably imagined.
Well, that's in a way why I wanted to talk about this this particular issue, because it'd be interesting to see how you feel, what the differences are between the book and the movie, and what that represents. Because it's interesting. I mean, in your infamous now preface to the French edition, you said, amongst other things, and this has been really grabbed onto by the group of people who I said we would never mention, that you felt that the book was in some ways a cautionary tale. They love that phrase. And I do feel like with everything else, the press has really been taking everything out of context and using it for their own particular purposes. What did you mean by that? Let's just get right out there. What did you mean when you said that the book was a cautionary tale? How literally did you mean that?
It has to be a cautionary tale. If not, it's a psychopathic statement. That's easier for you to live with than me. I mean, when I was writing the book, I certainly didn't think of it as a cautionary tale.
We're just getting some feedback.
Yeah. That's your pacemaker. Right?
It's the... Well, it's been a difficult time. Yeah.
I certainly didn't think of it as a cautionary tale. I mean, I was exploring the apparent sort of links in what I sensed in the very early 70s in the sort of popular sensorium between violence and sexuality, and in particular between the car and sexuality. And I was just sort of running down a particular sort of glimpse that I'd had of you know, this hair that was running a long way away, you know, a long way ahead of me. Looking back, though, it seems to me that the book is a cautionary tale in the, you know, along with, I mean, it's one of those where the writer or the filmmaker plays the devil's advocate,
right,
and completely adopts this, you know, what seems to be an insane or perverse logic in order to make a larger point. Swift did it in Modest Proposal, and you know, filmmakers like Kubrick did it in Strangelove.
Right. So it's interesting because you're saying that the cautionary tale aspect was not felt by you as an initial structure or reason for doing it, because some people would like to interpret that as meaning that you wrote this as a kind of a fable warning people against this and that, which I feel that interpretation that way, it diminishes what the book does and the scope of the book. You know, if it's only something that says don't do, people want to interpret it as meaning don't do this. You know, kids do not do this at home. Okay, what you read in this book or see in this movie, and that's obviously not how it arose.
No, I mean I've never said, the book appears to give the impression, and to some extent, you know, the film does too, that car crashes are sexually fulfilling. I've never said that car crashes were sexually fulfilling. I've been in a car crash and it did nothing for my libido. What I was saying was that the idea of the car crash is sexually exciting or intriguing.
Yes.
And by sex, I mean sort of, you know, all the sort of aggressive and sexual energies that compel some young men to chase women drivers who dare to overtake them. I mean, the fact that the notion that the idea of a car crash is sexually exciting is...
Another betrayal by technology.
Yeah, I know, you
Okay.
can't rely on it.
Okay. Yeah.
The idea that a car, that, you know, the notion that the idea of a car crash is sexually exciting is much more disturbing in a way, because it asks much greater questions about who we are. I mean, if we're really, if thinking about car crashes, excites us, there's something very strange going on, in the human psyche. And that appears to be confirmed by the entertainment culture in which we live, which is saturated.
Yes.
It has been for the last
Yes.
30 or 40 years.
Yeah,
with-
well, actually, I had the experience of someone saying to me, the car crashes in your movie are not very realistic. And I said, really? What do you mean? He said, well, there's no slow motion. You're not seeing it from 5 different angles. And so obviously I said, have you ever been in a car crash? He said, no. So obviously his understanding of the reality of a car crash was totally formed by Hollywood. And that was his new reality. So all I had to do was not use slow motion, and we were in another world. In the same vein, people like to quote your talk of the book being the first sort of techno-porn novel. And that also leaves a lot of room for misunderstanding, especially when the phrase is just taken out of context. What did you mean? You didn't say techno-porn, you said the first novel was...
Yes, I think this is 1973. I said
Yes.
I like to think of it, of Crash as the first pornographic novel based on technology. Of course, pornography then had very different
Yes.
connotations.
Yeah.
Then it really just meant explicit sexuality,
Yeah.
which was a newcomer to fiction and the movies.
Yes.
Even in the early 70s. There was very little explicit sex in the novel then. The Last Exit trial and the Lady Chatterley's Lava trial here had only just been over. People don't realize that the sort of explicit sexual description you get in novels today, or in films for that matter, didn't exist then. Now, pornography, the word pornography it's become one of those all things to all
Yes.
people. It's one of those happily undefined
Yes,
words, like
it's the
fascism.
Yeah, well,
Anybody can use for whatever purposes
the
they like.
pornography of war, the pornography of racism, the pornography of poverty. And
Generally,
at that point, you don't know.
things you disapprove of.
Yes, of course.
Especially paedophile sex and SM and sex that abuses, pornography that abuses women and so on.
Eventually.
I wasn't thinking of that sort
Yeah.
of thing.
Well, eventually we'll get the pornography of pornography. I'm waiting for that.
Could be your next movie.
Yeah. I think we have our hands full with this one.
You've already made your next movie. It's called Crash.
You're right. Well, what next?
I was interested in the pornography business because, as you said, it's been used very easily over the film.
Yes.
Have you ever been asked to make a kind of clear case against Crash being labeled pornographic?
Well, first of all, I'm not against pornography. In fact, So I hate being put into a position where I have to defend the film against being pornographic, because the assumption has to be that if it were, that would be a bad thing. However, just for the sake of accuracy, for me, for pornography to mean anything, it has to have a very specific definition. And for me, I go back to the Greek roots. Pornographia, it means writing about prostitutes. It was originally writing or art of any kind that was meant solely for the purpose of sexual arousal. It had no other purpose. That was what it was for. And so the porn films that one sees are pornography because that's what they're for. They don't make any pretensions to do anything else. On that level, obviously, Crash is not pornography. It's obviously not meant. In fact, people complain. They say, "Gee, I wasn't. There was a lot of sex and I wasn't turned on well, you know, that, yeah. Part of that was the point, and part of that was the situation of the characters. Now, of course, I would like, by the end of the film, that you had, your feeling for the what was erotic and what was not might well have shifted, because that's what the book did. I mean, the book I found to be very, at first, cold and clinical, and all the descriptions of sex were very medical. There was no passion words, you know, no street sex words. It was all anus and penis and vagina and all that stuff, and which is normally a turn-off. But by the end of the book, these words, along with the words like nacelle and speedometer, were starting to get very sexy. And I thought, well, he's really done something to my head here, you know? And so in that sense, I would say you were successful even in those terms, because it was porn, it was techno porn. I mean, it was arousing. It wasn't obviously only for that purpose, though, and that's a whole other discussion. It was erotic, let's put it that way.
I think it's true to say that when you first came across the book and thought about filming it,
Yeah.
you were very reluctant. I mean, you didn't care for the book.
That's
I mean,
true.
you've produced a brilliant film, but going back, what, 5 to 10 years?
More like 10.
10 years.
Yeah.
I think it's true that you found the book hard going and didn't really, you know, want to film it. Now, what changed your mind?
Well, it was, I can only analyze it after the fact, as it's similar to you thinking about, you know, the cautionary tale after the fact, seeing that that was what it must be, even though at the time you wouldn't have labeled it that. The book just started a process in me that was continuing, and I didn't realize how much it had changed until maybe 2 years after I'd read the book. And Jeremy Thomas and I had been finishing Naked Lunch, and he said to me, is there anything that you want to do? Is there anything that you're passionate about that we should work together and do another movie? And I said, yeah, I think we should do we should do Crash. And then I said to myself, well, why did I say that, you know? I completely surprised myself. And of course, Jeremy ran with it. He said, well, I know Ballard, I'll introduce you. I've already optioned the book many times, or in the past, and he got very excited. But I was still left saying, why did I say that? And the only thing that I could come up with is what I come up with now, is that the book had started a process in me that I could only complete by making a film of it, because that is my means of exploring, you know, my reactions to things and my understanding of my own life and all that. So that's really it. I still don't have a better explanation for it. In the making of the movie, I felt that I got much closer to the book than I'd ever been before, and it became something. It doesn't matter whether I liked it or not. I mean, it was really beyond liking or not liking. It had become necessary. You know, I needed the book somehow, and at that point, it was a powerful part of my nervous system.
I mean, you only within a year or two beforehand, you'd filmed another very difficult book.
Yes.
Naked Lunch, Burroughs' Naked Lunch. Almost unfilmable.
Yeah.
The novel is really just a series of cabaret turns, and I think it was, you know, it was remarkable the way you sort of overlaid the chronology of Burroughs' life onto this series of cabaret turns that is the Naked Lunch. Yeah. I'm surprised, in a way, I mean, it's to your credit, that having tackled one monster of a problem in Naked Lunch, you went on to another monster.
Yeah.
I mean, it's you know, I think it's to your credit. I mean, it's to Jeremy Thomas's credit that you know, that having, you know, had to cope with a Naked Lunch. Yeah. You know, you moved on to.
Well, I thought it would be a similar
like
process. I thought that I would have to. I mean, what I'm always struck by so strongly is when faced with an adaptation, and I've done 3. I've done Stephen King's Dead Zone and Naked Lunch and Crash, and M. Butterfly, which was a play, which is another story, and it is, to me, in fact, all books are unfilmable. I mean, the old joke is how do you film a book? You put it there, you get some lights, and you shoot it. Because that is about as accurate as any other description of it, because you can't really film them. All books are unfilmable. You have to reinvent them for the screen and hope that somehow there are legitimate connections between what you've done and the book. But I did think that I would be faced with making a construct the way I had done with Naked Lunch. So I might have come to Shepperton, and talked to you about your past and your childhood and things like I did with Burroughs. And take things from other works and so on, which is also what I did with Naked Lunch. But in fact, when I started to work on the script, it just distilled into the script almost instantaneously. I mean, it was actually very easy for me to write, which revealed to me that the book, in some way, was innately cinematic. Much more than Naked Lunch ever was. I mean, you can see the obvious things. The obvious things are that it has characters who continue from beginning to end, that there is that it's written in the first person, and so you have that sort of continuity of at least a consciousness from beginning to end, which Naked Lunch isn't. And there is a plot that develops, even though it's a strange plot. And all of those things made it a much easier adaptation than Naked Lunch was for me.
In a way, it's not a criticism at all, but I wish you'd been able to persuade Elizabeth Taylor to play herself. She appears in the novel as the target of.
See, this is where Jim's.
This is where I know nothing.
This is where Jim says sayonara to reality. First of all, Liz is what, 65? Most people who would come to see this movie, Liz Taylor is a matronly lady who does AIDS benefits.
I know.
The other problem, and it's worth discussing though, because it is many people's favorite part of the book, but even Liz is not Liz anymore. She doesn't mean what she meant. And the other thing, the other thing was that
I was joking.
I know, but I'm serious.
The film. I think. Let me just say this. I think the film is better for not having Liz Taylor, or let's say a younger equivalent. I mean, if you'd introduced into the film an actress, let's say an actor. Well,
there isn't really an equivalent to Liz Taylor because things have changed. I mean, that's actually an interesting thing.
But if you'd introduced a fictional actress,
yes,
a fictional famous actress to play along with, to become a target in the way that Dean and Mansfield and Camus are targets.
Yes.
I don't think it would have worked. Actually.
No,
I think you extracted the sort of purest essence of Crash by dropping the Elizabeth Taylor notion, actually.
Well, because the other thing was that I really worried that it would diminish Vaughn as a character because he would become a celebrity stalker. I mean, there wasn't that category in the early 70s, and it's become a category. It would be very easy to dismiss Vaughn as a psychotic who is a celebrity stalker, and therefore the other interesting aspects of him would sort of fade into insignificance. I mean, you could see the press, what they would say about that. Glamorizing celebrity stalkers, you can see it now. Perverse movie playing in Britain.
Also, the problem is, the other problem, of course, is that the film already contains a number of stars. I mean, it contains Holly Hunter,
that's true,
Rosanna Arquette, James Spader. A fictional movie star would be clashing with the real movie stars.
That's true.
Playing ordinary people. I mean, you'd have had a sort of confusion of levels.
Yeah. James Dean was the safest bet. He was dead.
Right.
His lawyers were dead. Fantastic. But I did feel, though, the need for a Hollywood icon at the center of the movie because that was the part of the Elizabeth Taylor thing that was critical, and I think it would have damaged the film if that hadn't been there.
No. I think the film is better for not having a
Hollywood
James Dean
icon.
Oh, Dean, right?
Yeah.
Because he lies
not as a character, but
Dean
as a
lies
presence.
in the sort of archaeology of 20th century sort of psychopathology, doesn't he? I mean, he's this young star who willed his own death in this Porsche. No, I think when I went to the Cannes Film Festival with David and the cast for the premiere there, and I met the cast and worked very closely with them during the sort of 4 or 5 days of publicity. And what impressed me was that these very successful Hollywood stars, in at least 3 cases, all of them, in fact, all 5 of the main actors, were deeply involved with the film.
Yes.
This wasn't just a job. I mean, listening in on the interviews they were conducting, I mean, Holly Hunter was fighting her corner, feisty little lady.
Yeah.
She was, I mean, when these rather sort of bored but rather sort of cruel journalists from major news agencies and the like were trying to pick her off, she snapped back at them hard. And the same was true of Rosanna Arquette, Deborah Unger, and Katias Spader. They were all deeply involved in the film. And
In
this was
fact, Holly
some time
desperately
after.
wanted to be here for the she's shooting a film with.
But I'm interested, and the audience I think will be interested in how you managed to involve them so passionately in this rather, I mean, let's face it, at first sight, rather perverse drama.
It was actually drugs and hypnotism.
Oh.
Works every time. I found that that's the best way to deal with actors. Well, of course, they had to want to do it. I mean, you can't, there's no way that you can drag somebody into a movie like this, kicking and screaming, or with the lure of money, which we did not have. Everybody, in fact, worked for a lot less than they normally do. And they were, you have to find it really is to me like trying to find the right kids to play in your sandbox, I mean, it is very playful. There is that element. You are dressing up in funny clothes and calling each other funny names and putting on makeup. And the set, in fact, for Crash was very funny, very warm, very relaxed, very enthusiastic. You can't really tell from a film. I mean, I've heard that Ingmar Bergman's sets were a laugh riot, cries and whispers, fun. So, but I believe it, because you need the balance. You need the intensities there in front of the camera, and then the humor and the warmth and all of that is everywhere else. And there were practical things too. I mean, I had a monitor that I used to tape everything we were doing that was actually showing the image right through the camera, which is very common these days. But there are some directors who don't allow the cast to watch those monitors because they're worried that they'll become obsessed with looking at themselves and worrying about insignificant things. My technique was to get the best color monitor I could, tape everything, and show the actors everything. They had complete access to seeing what they looked like, what they sounded like at all times. I don't mean just for the sex scenes, but obviously it was particularly critical there. But for all of the scenes, so that there were no surprises. It was very collaborative, and they didn't feel shut out or that there were any hidden agendas or anything like that. And I think it's also the way I have to work. I mean, I wouldn't be good trying the Oliver Stone thing, I just would be bad at it. And so it's not, I can't take much credit for this. This is a natural way it worked. But with these particular actors, that was the way to go, and it worked beautifully. They knew they were there from the first day.
I got the impression at Cannes that they were still in the movie, actually. They were still
they,
playing
they,
their roles.
they do have trouble separating.
I didn't want any of them
they
to get
follow me
into
all
a
the
car
time.
behind a wheel,
I think they want to do Crashes, the sequel. But I'm worried that people will think that'll be about computers. So, I don't know. It could be a sci-fi, yet more sci-fi. I'm not sure.
I mean, just to say that it sounds almost, it sounds very playful and easy, but presumably some of those scenes, one's talking about several takes, and I'm
many
wondering
takes,
if,
yeah.
like the scene where Deborah Unger and James Spader are evoking Vaughan
Yes.
during that
Yeah.
sex scene.
It's grueling, actually. It's not. It just like in the sense that I feel that the characters in the movie ultimately go beyond sex. I mean, certainly the best walkout moment in the film is when Vaughan and Ballard kiss. This is, I mean, because a lot of young men leave at that point. and they can't. I think it's because they've invested so much of their heterosexual sexuality in this stud James Spader, if they're seeing the movie that way anyway. And then suddenly he's having sex with a man. They can't deal with it. They walk out. But I'm saying that in a way the characters are moving beyond sexuality, beyond sex, beyond gender to some other thing. Which they don't totally achieve by the end of the movie, but that seems to be where they're going. That's part of their experiment. That's part of their escape and their freedom. And in a way, that happens on the set. It begins with nudity. What position shall we be in? You have to choreograph it. You have to figure it out. Then after 5 hours later, you're worrying about the continuity of the hair on the pillow, and you're worried about getting the makeup on the pillow, and you're worried. It's beyond sex, believe me. It's far beyond sex, and it's into some other strange movie thing. And it's very grueling, and the art is to make it look like it was one take, a take that you just happened to get, and it was fantastic. But of course, it takes hours and hours. Some of those scenes took days to shoot. They were my special effects scenes, really.
Yes, I think one of the greatest scenes in the film, and I think it's one of the greatest scenes in the entire output of the cinema of this century, is the car wash scene. And I strongly urge those of you who haven't seen the film to see it and to concentrate in particular on that brilliant scene, because sound is used in a way that I've never known before in almost any kind of film. I mean, I was saying to David half an hour ago that, except for The Telltale Heart, on an early 1930s film based on an Edgar Allan Poe story where the heart beat mysteriously from this body buried under the floorboards begins to dominate the life of the character. Apart from that film, there's no film I've known where sound has played such a role. Those whirling rollers hitting the glass and all that foam. And I mean, it is an extraordinary combination of all the effects that the cinema is capable of. It's a virtuoso piece of filmmaking.
Gee,
all the rest you could have dropped.
Well, I do have it playing constantly on my wall in the living room at home. It's also the longest car wash scene in history. I think I can vouch for that. And when people say, when Ted Turner, for example, says, I can't, I'm through the day when teenagers will start to do copycat things based on Crash, I'm thinking, they're going to take long car washes with their girlfriends. That is going to be scary. Really scary.
Here's just one thing. You mentioned that you met with Burroughs when you were doing Naked Lunch and talked about his life and everything. Yeah. So it reminds me of Crash, because you didn't talk in that way to each other, but you had actually said at one time that it was your most autobiographical novel. I wonder if you could elaborate on the...
Yeah, that's
autobiography.
see, that's the thing. I mean, the first thing that struck me when I started to read the book was that the main character was called James Ballard. This is very unusual, especially when it's that book. And that's why I mentioned the sort of David Cronenberg. That would be the cinematic equivalent of what you did in the book. But it is very unusual, and it does lead one to say, well, did you live this? How accurate is this? And here's this question.
Not literally, but in the mind, of course. Why invent a character who's having who's working his way through this sort of extraordinary landscape when I can simply use my own name and give this novel what I think is, a degree of honesty that would be absent otherwise. I mean, by the same token, in a way, you should have called the character David Cronenberg. Of course, you don't have first-person narration in films.
Would be different. It would feel different.
Unless you'd used a voiceover, which I would have rather liked, actually. But I know it's so old-fashioned. It makes you shake and
Never
shiver.
works. It never works. I mean, I really, truly, I think that is that's the usual cop-out when somebody's doing a movie of a book, and then they realize that they feel that they haven't got the book, so they get Jean Moreau to read the book, or they get, you know, I really didn't feel it worked in Apocalypse Now, and I don't. There are one or two where it can work because it's used in perhaps an ironic way or a different. It worked in Badlands. There's a voiceover in the movie Badlands. I think it works very well.
It worked in classic films of the 40s and 50s, didn't it? Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard.
Yes.
Without the voiceovers, they would be very alienating movies because the voiceover is rather close. I mean, Shakespeare used the voiceover. It's called the soliloquy.
Yeah.
It's a way of, you know, I mean, if you look at Hamlet or Macbeth, I mean, most of the characters are extremely unpleasant. The voiceover, I mean, if you look at Double Indemnity or Sunset Boulevard or Badlands, the characters are all extremely unpleasant.
Yeah.
Yet the voiceover bridges the gap between audience and characters, doesn't it?
But
I mean, in fact, I think you're right that using a voiceover in your film of Crash would have spoilt the film because, in a way, it would have said we need to bridge a gap.
Yeah, I
think where David's film is so original is that it introduces this, extremely threatening subject matter, but doesn't distance it in any way. If you think of films like, a couple of weeks ago I ran my video of Blue Velvet, brilliant film, a masterpiece in its own way. And it struck, I mean, it's far more violent than Crash, and there's the perverse sex in it is at least as perverse as anything in Crash. I sort of, you know, Reservoir Dogs, another extremely violent, crude and brutal film, much more likely to incite young men to dangerous behavior than anything in Crash. But in both those films, there's a distance. You watch them and you think, but this is all happening to these sort of perverted nightclub singers and gangsters. In Crash, there is no distance. The characters are you in the audience. There's no way you can escape. I mean, when I wrote Crash 23 years ago, and people interviewed me at the time, thinking, well, what is this book, you know? And I said, I wanted to write a book where, you know, the reader had nowhere to hide. And I think the film goer, watching David's film, has nowhere to hide. The people on screen are the people in the audience. Whether you, I mean, you may say, oh, God's sake, that's all rubbish. You know, I don't get turned on by the idea of car crashes.
Or you might say, I'm not as cute as James Spader. You might be right.
Yeah, but I think there's no distance between the characters on screen.
Well, imagine a voiceover.
That's
too.
what's so frightening.
Yeah.
A voiceover would have introduced a bit of distance.
Yeah, because
it would have said, I don't want you to feel worried, you people in the audience. This is a strange film, but this is how it happened.
Yeah, it becomes and I have to say that after I screened this, the first cut of the film for one of the American distributors, executives, he said, I don't know how people are going to access this film.
That's lovely.
And I said, yeah, I don't either. And then he said, I'm going to make a suggestion now, and I know you're going to hate it. And I said, voiceover, right? He said, right, voiceover. And what he really wanted was the voiceover to be a voice of comfort and to explain the film to everybody. I mean, that's actually what he wanted. And he was very insistent, and it took quite a long time before, until its success at Cannes, until it had some success in France, quite a lot. You know, 700,000 people saw it, and no one ran amok, and quite a few people managed to access it. You know, that he began to relax. But until that point, he was very insulted that I wasn't at least trying it, and I knew it wouldn't work. I mean, I said to him, you know, I actually don't know what the voiceover should say. You know. When Vaughn appeared that evening, my heart raced. I was terrified. You know, I mean, or the reason that I did this was, you know, I mean, you can see all the silly things, and in essence, unless it was some counterpoint
I meant
or
you
something.
should have just read the whole book out, you know.
Well, of course you meant that. And if the screen was blank while it was being read, I would go along with that.
A lot of the, obviously a lot of the criticisms that have arisen come out of a sort of moral outrage. And I know that
Well, see, I don't think it's obvious. I think that's the pretense, but I don't think it's real moral outrage at all. Because first of all, you know this, but I mean, a lot of that outrage is from people who have not seen the film. So how can they be outraged? I mean, really, how can they dare say those things if they have not seen the film? They're being outraged because other people are outraged, and it all goes back, of course, to Alexander Walker, who's up until last week was probably the only one in Britain who'd seen the film. So it all came from his initial beyond the bounds of perversity, beyond the bounds of depravity. That's, you know, and even with that I had problems, because if you're beyond the bounds of depravity, then you're not within the country of depravity, you're somewhere else. So he hasn't really told us much. Anyway, it's a literary quote.
No, the first I've often told this little anecdote, but the first reader, my publisher, who came across Crash in 1972, I think, the year before it was published, said she was the wife of a famous TV psychiatrist. And I think she had some sort of psychiatric training herself. And the first wife, I may say. And she said in her reader's report to the publisher, the author of this book is beyond psychiatric help. And my reaction was total artistic success. And I feel the same about the reactions to your film. But,
Well, and in fact, you have been beyond psychiatric help, haven't you? Which is fine. It means he's healthy. No problem.
yeah, I mean, what David doesn't realize is that the screening of Crash at the London Film Festival has coincided with this sort of panic that the present Conservative regime feels in the face of almost certain electoral defeat well, this is true, next May. I mean, they're climbing aboard every conceivable bandwagon, as they've done in their flustered state for the last couple of years. I mean, you know, child is savaged to death tragically by a pit bull, and legislation is immediately cobbled together and enacted in a great flurry of moral righteousness to ban sort of all aggressive dogs, rightly maybe, just tragedy at Dunblane where 16 small children were shot dead by this middle-aged paedophile a year ago. I mean, a ghastly crime and a terrible thing to happen to the children and their parents. But there are people quoted, I think a town councillor was quoted in one of the papers today as sort of linking Crash, David's film, in some way to Dunblane and the murder of the schoolmaster Philip Lawrence earlier this year, tragically, by one of his 15-year-old pupils on the street outside his school in North London. The political parties who are really in a sort of degenerate state. You see this in the United States. Nobody cares who's elected president. It doesn't really matter. And we're moving into the sort of the irrelevancy of politics. Those who occupy the 650 seats or whatever in the House of Commons are desperate to seize the moral high ground. They're climbing on every conceivable hobby horse. Crash has suddenly got onto their radar screen, and they've locked onto it. Yeah. It's a shame in a way, because it has nothing to do with the film.
Yeah. That doesn't totally explain though why there was less of an outrage when the book was published, as opposed to the flack that the film might get. Is that to do with an assumption on behalf of people who are guiding morals that less people read?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that. The cinema is the dominant form in which the 20th century imagination shapes itself. It's even more powerful, I think, than television, which, on one level, has a greater sort of daily influence. I mean, TV surrounds us like all those sort of packets of cornflakes in the kitchen and the mix master and the washing machine and a packet of Daz and so on, but film is where the 20th century imagination really expresses itself. I think the book, the novel, is tragically it's sort of moving towards irrelevance. I mean, it's people are not outraged by novels anymore. They were once,
Yes.
but not now. Film is the dominant medium. But you know, we in the novel, we still sort of supply, you know, a kind of
Yes. Yeah.
I know. You can't quite dispense with this.
Well, in fact, I mean,
I know I know you're working on it.
No, in fact not. The interesting thing for me is that you know, the cinema has always been fed by literature hugely, right from its inception. And writing is still a crucial part of filmmaking, even if whether it's a novel or not. You know, the writing is important. It's the written word is still there. So, and I have to say that I've found, and this is not, it's just a true description of my experience, but when I began to make films, well, I had to write my own scripts because there was no other way to do it. I mean, I had no resources other than my writing. And I was very arrogant and condescending in terms of, you know, adaptations. Why would, you know, someone has to use a book? I mean, I used to think about Kubrick going through book after book after book looking for something that he could cling to, and I'd think, well, you know, I don't have that problem, and I didn't. But when I did The Dead Zone, I was surprised to find that it didn't feel that much different to me.
This is a Stephen King novel.
Yeah. It somehow, in the process of making the film, you kind of fuse with the material, and it's almost as though the book was a dream that you had. You know, you wake up and I had this dream called Crash, and I don't mean that by saying that I'm diminishing what the book is. Obviously, the movie wouldn't exist if the book hadn't existed. But somehow it feels as close to you making the film, and I realize that it doesn't really matter where it comes from. I mean, whether it's a song or a play or a book, for the filmmaker, ultimately, if it works, you fused your own self with it, and it feels all of a piece. So I've stopped worrying about that. You know, am I going backwards by adapting something else, or should I not write something original? It seems to be irrelevant. Do you want to open it up to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, we now have some time for questions. So, first one down here. You, yeah.
What did you have to leave out of the film? Obviously, a 2-hour film or whatever, you can't put everything in. So how did you make your decisions? I must put this in and I must leave this out.
Well, yeah, it's a strange process. I didn't reread the book. I didn't have the book open beside me. I didn't have it marked up on the wall. I, in fact, wrote the script not having read the book for a couple of years. And what you do is you kind of do a kind of a self-hypnosis thing with some mantras and other stuff. And you just hope that the spirit of the book is there in you, and you start to write. And then eventually you do go back and start to check how things were configured in the book. But it's you really have to suffuse yourself with it's not just the book, it's with Ballardism, you know. Just as I became, you know, sort of engulfed in Burroughsiana, you know, I would read. So it's a, and then it's really, you only have your intuition to guide you. It's a strange thing, and it's not really a question of shall I leave this in or out. I mean, for example, the Liz Taylor thing. I didn't think twice about it. It was gone. There's no question in my mind. It was only after the fact, when you're doing interviews, when you're talking to people about it, that you become analytical about these things that you were, in fact, totally intuitive about doing. It just felt wrong. I just knew that it wouldn't work. I felt that it wouldn't work. You do try things on paper, but they don't work. You know, you shuffle things around. So it's not really a process of saying, it's not analytical, it's not a calculation. It's really more like an invocation, you know, to be suffused by the spirit of the book and the author. Although that sounds a bit vague, it's very palpable and real and tangible when you're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a question for Mr. Ballard.
how has film affected me as a writer? I mean, with reference, in this case, to Empire of the Sun, which is full of film imagery. Well, film, right from my earliest, right from the age of sort of 7 or 8, I was a big film goer, with my parents my nanny. It was a form of babysitting. What TV is, as a babysitter today, I think film was in the 1930s. I mean, when my parents couldn't stand this hyperactive child charging around the place, they tell the Chinese nanny or the whatever, White Russian nanny, sort of, oh God, take him to the cinema. And so I loved sitting in these huge empty cinemas, giant theaters, 10 times the size of this one, in Shanghai, watching films. I adored film, and I've always tried to make my novels like films, because I think film has got the kind of grammar and the language and the way the 20th century imagination sees itself. So I'd like to think that, that my fiction, which some people find, very difficult and so on, is in fact very close to cinema. I know a filmmaker like David would say, "What rubbish this man is saying."
I wouldn't dare say that.
But
Not.
cinema is so important. I mean, there's no question about it.
See, it's interesting for me, because I some time ago I interviewed Salman Rushdie for a magazine in Canada, and one of the things I asked him was, do you think that the cinema is an inferior art form to the novel? And he looked at me as though he didn't know what I was talking about, because he too had been raised on cinema, and yet Bergman always felt that he was not a real artist, because for him, growing up when he did, real artists wrote novels, and that's why he published his 4 screenplays. He rewrote them so that they'd be more literary. They weren't really like screenplays at all, and so on. And I suppose there's that lingering, it might be a Victorian remnant, residue, but there are things that you can do in fiction and writing that you simply cannot do in cinema, and vice versa, obviously, but I don't really think one supplants the other, I mean, they enhance each other and they reflect on each other. Ideally, that would be the way it would be. I mean, I think to read the book of Crash and to see the movie of Crash together would be a much richer and more dynamic experience than to experience either one alone. And I don't think it would be great for fiction to become cinema, to become an inferior version of cinema, or vice versa, I have great respect for the art of fiction, huge, in fact.
Yeah, in the middle here.
Ballard says that in some way what he was saying through writing the book was different at the end of doing it than when he started.
Yes.
And I want to know whether both of you think that you were doing the same thing by making the film, or saying the same thing.
Yes. Well, this brings up, once again, are we saying the same thing? I'm saying this for the mics here. Do we feel that we have been saying the same things with the book and the movie? I believe definitely not, although there are many overlays and crossovers. At the press conference in Cannes, it was quite interesting, because we had heard that the press were very divided and vocal about the film, and there were almost fistfights and yellings and screamings and stuff. And then we had to move our press conference into the big theater, because there was 300 press, 3 times as many as the normal press screening, and we were all up there ready for a fight. We had 5 actors and producers and Jim and myself, and we were ready for a fight. And one of the first things that came up was a Finnish journalist who said, "I think that the movie, just does not go as far as the book." And Jim said, "I completely disagree with you. I think the movie goes much further than the book. In fact, the movie starts where the book ends." So that ended that discussion, and after that, the press were very sweet. They were very, in a way it was too bad, because we were ready for a fight. Holly, as you say, she was ready, and it was, but I completely understood that not to mean at all that the movie was better than the book or anything like that, just that it did go off in a different direction. Part of it is the time. I mean, the book is 25 years ago, and we are now, and I couldn't possibly go back to that sensibility, even if I wanted to. But I do believe that the two are quite different in many, many ways, and which is another reason that I asked about the cautionary tale element and so on, because some journalists, there are some intelligent ones who would say, do you think that your movie is a cautionary tale? And I say no. I don't feel it that way. Now, it's conceivable that with the perspective of time, I might see it much more that way. But to make the movie, I had to do really what Jim did, which is to be the character. I had to live that life, and that is why in the movie there is no superimposed and really false moral stand taken by the filmmaker. I wanted to allow my characters, it was like a lab experiment in a way, I want the characters to be allowed to do what they're going to do, go where they go, and see what happens. If I am always there looking over the shoulder saying, see, this is, bad, now what you're doing, see, this is bad, it deranges the film. Even if that might be the effect that it has afterwards, during the course of making the film, you can't feel that way about it. The moral stance, as understood by Hollywood, is almost a narrative device, or it's a part of characterization. You have to give the character moral indignation. You have to be, as a filmmaker, morally outraged. But how many times have we seen films, from Hollywood in particular, where we know that no one involved in the film gave a damn about that aspect of it? It was just there as a plot device to motivate the character to jump on the bus, or to take his gun finally out of the drawer. But that's all. You feel it as a machine, as machinery, as a mechanical device. And what I wanted to do, and certainly what I felt when I read the book, was that it would be much stronger and much more revealing, absolutely, to accept that that was not the project. You just forget that now. And after the fact, and in the course of time, you begin to see what meaning the movie might have in that.
I think that's a key thing. I think the absence of a moral frame around the film, same absence that is present in the novel, that absence is what's so original about the film. I mean, if you think of the huge output of violent films from Hollywood, all the Die Hard films and so on, Broken Arrow, whatever comes along this week, there's always a saving moral frame. The hero is working with CIA or whatever it may be. Bruce Willis is not allowed to play a baddie. He's always on the side of the powers that preside over our world and hold it together. What I'm really impressed about your film, because it's much more difficult in a public medium like cinema to bring this off, is the way you've eliminated or you've dispensed with the moral frame. You present the events of the film without any apparent sort of easy get out for the audience or for the characters within the film. I mean, you present. I don't think I've ever seen a film in which there is no moral frame in quite the same way. I don't think I've ever seen a film where there is no attempt whatsoever to sort of moralize away the events being portrayed. I think that's Crash's originality, your film's originality. You present these extraordinary events, as you say, a sort of metaphor for, as you said in your interviews here, a metaphor for sort of a larger fusion of all sorts of challenging ideas, but without any attempt to justify within a conventional sort of moral calculus what is going on. Now that, I think, is the main achievement, I think, of the film. I mean, that's not something that one wants to say too loud.
No, well, I mean,
But I think it is.
Yeah,
it is its great achievement.
One critic did say to me that the thing that was the most frightening thing for him about the movie was this lack of a moral stance. And I said, but in a sense, that is the subject of the film.
Exactly.
And to impose one would be to subvert what the movie was all about. It would also suggest that I had the answer, and I don't. So the movie also raises questions that I don't have answers for. So I wanted to let the character to say, well, what Vaughn is doing, maybe it's okay. You know, maybe it would be good. Now, this is in order to allow him to continue to the end of the film. It's interpreted, though, in quite a different way by people who I truly don't believe that if we tacked a little moralizing ending onto the film where they were all arrested and confessed that they, you know, had done bad and were misguided, that I wonder if the critics and the press hysteria would really be different. I'm not sure that it would. Maybe it would. I'm not so sure.
The press need a get out. You know. Yeah, I mean, one's got to stand by whatever one believes in. You know, I mean, Crash, both book and film, would be meaningless if some sort of explicit moral justification was tacked around all this material. You know, I mean, the moral framework, if there is to be one, is provided by the audience. The novel and the film each is an extreme hypothesis. I mean, these, as I see it, these tendencies are inscribed in the world in which we live. This sort of strange fusion of sexuality and violence and sensation in this sort of affectless realm, you know, that is the late 20th century. Where do the lines on this graph seem to lead? Now, Crash film and book represents the end point, an extreme extrapolation beyond the graph paper of where these lines are leading. It's not a prophecy. Yeah. It's just an extrapolation, if you like. No moral point is being made, but perhaps a truth is being reached, and that is, you know, in the case of your film, that is achieved by, you know, the narrative drive and the accumulation of images that drive one towards drive the film towards credibility. I think the film does arrive at a point of credibility. Now, whether one likes this, point of arrival, whether one wants to get off this particular train and face up to, what stands around the platform, is a different matter. But it's nothing to do with moral frameworks.
So we began by talking about the differences, and we've come back to the similarity. Maybe we meant exactly the same thing, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, gentleman at the back.
What is that platform? What is it about?
Well, let me give you my little rap about that, and then that also might illuminate some of the differences, but although we might once again end up it's not really a matter of disagreeing, it's almost a matter of a different interpretation of the same thing. For me, the movie is a kind of existentialist romance. And I mean that literally, card-carrying existentialist meaning of that word, in the sense that the characters have found that the old forms of love and sex and relationship and many other things have no longer work. I mean, they're going through the motions, but it's not working. And because of an epiphany that one of the characters has in a car crash, which breaks his car, it breaks his body, but it all, you know, it's sort of the imagery of the car, the nice little lines of traffic, which give you the illusion of order and control, are immediately destroyed in the chaos of any kind of car crash. And so suddenly you're crossing all the lines, the cars are spinning, you don't know what direction you're facing in. The car, which I show as being kind of a boring, I give the Ballard character a very boring car. It's comfy, it's cozy, it's completely acceptable, it's understood, non-threatening. And suddenly that's torn apart, his body's torn apart, the lanes, the traffic is chaotic. And his life is also torn apart. And he's got to put all of those things back together again. He finds that they won't go back together again because they had been coming apart anyway. And so he has to assign, they have to reinvent. He meets another group of people, a group of people who've gone through the same thing. And they begin to embark on a process of reinventing all of these former absolutes, which turn out to not be absolutes. Sexuality, they're reinventing eroticism, sexuality, love, many other things. And that's the trip that they go on in the movie. And they arrive at a very strange place, but in a way, for the characters, it's a bizarrely happy ending. I mean, I think this movie has a happy ending. Because the two main characters have come somehow to find a way to come back to each other, even though it's in an extremely strange place. And I happen to think that that's a legitimate metaphor for what does happen in each individual's life. I think we end up in a very strange place. So that's my interpretation, on one level, of the movie. And it might not be my interpretation of the book. In fact, it wouldn't be. So that's the difference. And yet, I think that the movie is also the book. So that it's a strange, multi-layered kind of interconnection between the two.
Yeah, I mean, the questioner asked, what is this platform that I referred to? I mean, the name of the platform is Love. This is the love station. I mean, the crash, bizarrely, you may think, is actually a love story between the two principal characters played by...
Now, do you see the book that way?
Yes, but I think you bring out that element, which is sort of
implicit, definitely.
Implicit in the novel. I think you make it explicit. I mean, the film is very much a love story. I'm being serious. I mean, this is one of the few ways left to the late 20th century, perhaps, to meet itself with, deep love and affection. The film is the love story.
It's basically
between
soft and cuddly.
Exactly.
Basically.
Spader and the beautiful Deborah Unger, playing husband and wife. I mean, the film is the story of their rediscovery of their love for each other. And I'm not being flippant. I mean,
no,
because
it's very difficult. It shows you where we are. It's very, very difficult to say that these days without it meaning.
It's a romance.
Yeah, without meaning something
film.
very weak and stupid.
One shouldn't be afraid of saying using words like romantic.
I agree. We have to say it because it's true.
It's a romantic film.
But if you say existentialist romance, it gives it a little toughness, don't you think?
Yes, gentleman here.
You as artists have always drawn a very clear distinction between your fairly extreme artistic imaginations and your more conservative day-to-day lives. And the question is, how do you feel, how do you react to the fact that the majority of people seem unwilling to accept that distinction?
Are you kidding? You should have seen him at Cannes. He was an animal. Well, it is strange. I think it's what it is though it is very understandable. I mean, even there's a sort of a mildly famous moment in my life was when Marty Scorsese told me that he had been terrified to meet me because he had seen my movies. This is the guy who made Taxi Driver. He was afraid to meet me, and he was very relieved to see that I looked very much to him like a Beverly Hills gynecologist. Of course, that was before I made Dead Ringers, so he might not have relaxed me. But really, the process, the relationship of an artist to his work is a quite strange, complex, intricate one that would lead Jim to say that Crash is more autobiographical to him than Empire of the Sun is. He did say that. And people might scratch their heads and say, well, how can that be? You know, and it is a true statement, but you have to it has to be interpreted. You know, it's an interior autobiography or an interior search. It's really it's not a one-to-one relationship. What you are, how you live, to what you. I mean, there is a sense that what you put up on screen as a filmmaker is what you fear, not what you live, not what you have, not what you wish for, but what you fear or what you want to control. I mean, even as the cinema is a great place for people to exercise their anxiety and fear by allowing it full reign in the cinema, and then you walk out and, unless you're in New York, you're someplace else. But if you're in New York, you go out of the cinema, same place. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but it's very difficult to convey that to people who have not actually experienced it themselves, and most people don't. I think most people do, but they're not aware of how they do it. So they assume, even if, as I say, even someone who should know better, another filmmaker could worry that the filmmaker was going to be what his work is directly. So it's that's, to me, that's the answer to that question.
I think it's an agreed one. Yep. Just behind.
I wonder what they thought of a similar film which had a similar press response and was outraged at its time, and a film which doesn't seem to have the redeeming value as you claim Crash has, which is Peeping Tom. I wonder what your reaction.
But I love that film, Peeping Tom. Yeah. The socially redeeming feature thing is a prickly one, you know, because my first response would be, you know, I pray that I will never make a film with socially redeeming features, because that's normally meant to mean some schoolmistressy kind of moralistic fable, you know, that even though you get the titillation of seeing naughty things, at the end it's okay because what it's really teaching you is that you weren't really titillated by what you were, but Peeping Tom is a brilliant film, and it certainly, I mean, in its day, it was, I think, it caused more of a stir than Crash, and in some ways did destroy Michael Powell's career, which on that level was an absolute tragedy. You know, it just was ahead of its time, or out of its time, as some of the best art always is, and was not understood at all. And especially since he was a filmmaker who had been considered quite classy and respectable and artistic, and then suddenly he makes this grotesque horror film about a psychotic, and seems to take some pleasure in it. This was a very disturbing film for people, and I think now it still is. I mean, even though it has been imitated by many lesser filmmakers hundreds of times, it still is a very powerful film. I don't know if I actually answered a question there.
I agree. I mean, Peeping Tom, which I saw when it first came out, there's sort of tacky things about Peeping Tom that immediately unsettle the reviewers, and, as David said, sort of eclipsed Michael Powell's career virtually, you know, for many, many years. I mean, the tackiness is partly that sort of Soho world that the insane camera killer inhabited. Also, I think in part there was sort of an absence, the partial absence of that moral frame unsettled people. The same problem that some people find with David's Crash.
Yeah, because he was really allowing the main character a chance to express himself in all levels, including very human and sympathetic ones, rather than portraying him
Yes,
as a monster.
the insets of what appeared to be home movies, which I think in fact were real home movies.
Yeah.
The father, the nominal father in Peeping Tom, was in fact Powell himself.
Yeah.
All that created a kind of ambivalence in the spectator's mind. It's, that the filmmaker in some ways sympathized with Carl Boehm, I think was the German actor or Dutch actor playing the killer. I mean, it was a very unsettling, no doubt about it, a very unsettling film. But it was still within the formulas of the the psychopathic movie. Crash is light years ahead of it, in fact. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think so, yeah. No, I mean it. I think
He could be wrong, but I know he means it.
no, I might be wrong, right, but I do mean it. No, I mean, I think because Crash defines its own terms, which Peeping Tom did not. Peeping Tom accepted the rules laid down by a certain kind of horror cinema. The whole film is saturated in the conventions of dark alleyways and cobblestone, little backyards and prostitutes, sort of horrid little boudoirs, Soho 1967 or
Sounds
whatever
great,
it was.
doesn't it?
Sounds great. But it was saturated in the conventions. It was a very, in appearance, it was a very conventional film. Crash is not a there are no conventions that Crash is relying upon. That's the originality of David's film.
And I think
he's not relying on any established conventions. The horror film, the sort of the film noir or whatever. Crash, David's film, creates its own rules from scratch. That's what's unsettling about it, because you can't take refuge in any sort of, you can't say, well, this is sort of, something like some other film. This, you can't escape the thing. I mean, it's coming at you, like a runaway truck. Peeping Tom was well within a certain set of conventions. Great film, no question about that.
Crash had a beginning and a middle and an end, did that all?
Well, not if you play it backwards. Really, I found right away there was a formalist issue with Crash when the several Italian journalists at Cannes went back to Italy and reported that this was totally a pornographic film. And in Cannes at the time, there was a channel on television in your room at the Carlton Hotel playing hardcore porn 24 hours a day.
We never found the button
to turn it off. So we, I was watching that and thinking about my film and saying, there's no similarity. I mean, what are these journalists talking about? Then I began to realize, the movie opens with 3 sex scenes in a row. This is a formal atrocity for almost any movie that you can think of, because it's not done. I mean, you might have 1 sex scene, then you go to something else. But the 3 in a row really confuses people, and I think then there are other sequential sex scenes, which is really very rarely done. Normally, in a Hollywood film in particular, but in other films, you have a sex scene, and if people don't like sex scenes or they're not very interested in it, they just kind of shut off while that's happening and wait for the movie to get going again. The scene is sort of modular. You could take it out and it wouldn't really affect the movie. But in Crash, when there's a sex scene on the screen, it is the movie. There is no other movie. There's no other movie to start again. And people actually sometimes giggle, or they have very strange reactions when after one sex scene there is another, and then there's another. But the problem is, of course, that they might stop watching. They might do that turn off, wait for the movie to get going again, and then they've missed the movie. It's also the juxtaposition of the sex scenes that tells you things, the reactions of people from one scene to the next. there is a sexual language involved, whether they have an orgasm or they don't, is telling you something about what's going on. It's not a frivolous thing or a peripheral thing. It is the subject at that moment. It is the defining moment of that thing. So I don't know that, I don't want to claim that there's never been another film that's done that, but obviously most people haven't seen one like that. And there are those problems when you are trying to play with cinematic form. I mean, it's not as extreme as, let's say, a Pillow Book, you know, where you know that you're playing another game entirely. It's not any kind of a narrative movie in the normal sense. Here, it could almost, you know, you see an attractive young upper middle class couple and they're having affairs, and, you know, is this going to be Fatal Attraction or something, you know? But then the way they speak and the way they relate to things and the way they react to things is quite odd and dissonant. And so I do think that this movie in particular, I have actually had the pleasure of having critics admit to me that they didn't get it the first time and they had to see it the second time. This is extraordinary because most critics would never admit that, even if it was true, or they don't go the second time, so they never really see the movie. But they're sort of bouncing off the surface of the film, off the structure the first time, trying to get in, and they can't because they're not letting go of their expectations based on other movies. Then the second time they see the movie, they know the game, you know, they see the structure, and they relax, and then the movie can reveal more things to them. So it's true that you know, that Peeping Tom doesn't work that way. You know, whether one is more valid or more groundbreaking or whatever than the other, I would stay out of that discussion myself. But because I think there's a way that you can work within a genre and still subvert the genre. I think I did that somewhat in The Fly, you know. So you could say that it's a legitimate horror film, and yet it's doing things that are not genre things. It's an interesting question, the categories and the formulas, and really a filmmaker is always needing to deal with people's expectations. What do they expect coming into the cinema? And that's why this press stuff that's going on is so destructive, because, well, just yesterday someone said to me that he can't really deal with violence in films. And so he came to Crash cringing every moment, waiting for the hideous things to happen. And they didn't happen. And 3/4 of the way through the movie, he realized that they weren't going to happen. It is not a violent movie. It's conceptually violent, but it's not physically on the screen violent. Compared, and I'm not being flippant when I say, you know, Braveheart is thousands of times more violent. And yet people think it's just a great, you know, historical romp. For children who walk in the middle of Braveheart, it's not that. It's quite excruciatingly horrifying. And I could say, well, if I put everybody in Crash in a kilt, would that be better? Would that give you that distance, you know? Anyway.
I think that's the one question here. Yeah.
Do you cast cars as carefully as you casted the actors?
Absolutely. Casting the cars was as crucial as casting the actors. And certainly the Lincoln is a character in the movie. And by the end of the movie is almost the reincarnation of Vaughn, you know. So Vaughn becomes the car. They fuse together. They look the same. They smell the same, you know. But it wasn't difficult in terms of the 63 Lincoln because that's in the book. And it's so perfect and potent, and with the Kennedy Association and all that, that was the easy part. The casting was easy. Finding the actual cars, and we had 6 of them, and cut some of them in half, and made a pickup truck out of one of them so that we could shoot from the back. So there was not just one car. The car wash scene was shot over a series of 3 days, different days, and part of it was shot in a car that was cut away. But I wanted, you know, Ballard's car, as I say, to be quite a boring car. I mean, if you've given that character a Ferrari, that's saying absolutely the wrong thing. The potency of technology is increased when it's invisible, and a car that you just jump in every day. I mean, there was Jacques Villeneuve is a brilliant Canadian Formula One racer, and he was on the cover of Wired magazine in his racing suit, and it said, Jacques Villeneuve, the ultimate man-machine interface. And I say no, actually not. The driver who jumps in his car to go to work and doesn't think twice about it is the ultimate man-machine interface. That is perfect. Villeneuve, as a racer, is always calculating and adjusting and changing and thinking. It's when it's invisible and automatic and natural, when you've embedded this car, this Dodge Dynasty, into your nervous system. We had to give it a fake symbol because everybody was worried we'd be sued, you know. That's when so yes, even casting that, and then Catherine's car is described as a small white sports car in the book, and I had to think, you know, do we give her a nice old Alfa? But no, that's too, you know, that's too. You have to take care of an old Alfa. What's the equivalent, you know, of a? And I came up with, we thought Miata, and the reason it's not white is my cameraman went crazy when I said it was going to be white, because you're shooting at night. And white reflects, and suddenly the car would always be overexposed if everything else was properly exposed. So we compromised with silver. So even in that sense, it's not just, it's more than casting, you know, it's cosmetic surgery as well. So the short answer is yes.
Yeah, at the back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I found that the characters, since we talk about the man-machine interface, I found the characters to be almost, the movements and everything are so precise, I found them almost to be automatons. Apart from the Vaughan character, the Elias Matthias character, who I found to be like the almost opposite of them, you know, breathing in fumes, if you like, and wandering through the movie as if he was completely out of it as far as, you know, his own mental process is concerned. But he was such a contrast. You deliberately do that this time.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, when you say deliberately, of course I want to take credit for everything. But once again, I think you're completely accurate, and I'd say that it was deliberate in an intuitive sense, because when you're working with the actors, the way, I mean, there's this scene where Vaughn is sort of hovering over Ballard's shoulder, and he's smelling him, you know, he's inhaling him, and he's almost touching him. It's very animal-like. It's very true, the actors, without us being conscious, but finding a style for the dialogue, and really, in a way, trying to find a cinematic way to deliver some of the subtle tones of the book. We came up, without really all saying, let's do it this way. The dialogue was very whispered and very slow and very narcotized, it was described as by somebody. I thought it was a nice word, kind of narcotized. But Vaughn is not that. You know, Vaughn is still an animal, and in a sense it's because he, being the furthest advanced along the way, the route that they're all going to take, is perhaps the freest of the machinery, that they are still engaged in that. That's how I would interpret that and try to make it my own.
Yeah.
How did Rosanna Arquette get involved in the movie? Because the role of Gabrielle seems a very unusual role for any actress to take. And how did you feel about that sex scene in the car with James Spader?
Well, Rosanna is a great girl. She wanted to be, you know, she had been talking to me about being in a film of mine, and she is really not afraid. I mean, none of the actors was. I mean, they're all not very conservative actors, as you can imagine. But I just put that together with the role, the fact that she wanted to work with me, and that I've always thought she was a wonderful actress who's often not used to the best and the most interesting way. She had a great time in that scene, actually. She loved the shackles. I mean, Holly was the other women were very jealous that she got to wear all that great gear, you know. In fact, they said, well, could I, you know, instead of this little scar on my cheek, could I maybe have a, you know, kind of a plastic kind of. It was, for her, it was great fun. I mean, and it was odd because she was nursing her first baby at the time, and you see that very clearly, I think, in the film. And she'd leap out of the car, which was cut away in several different ways, and then grab her kid and start nursing the kid with that gear on. She was pretty loose, you know. She was relaxed. Spader was the one, and it was physically difficult, you know, for him. It's all you've got to play how jammed and cramped that car is with the hand controls that keep getting in the way and all that. the film, it's interesting about, this is seen as sort of sex with a disabled person. Now, literally, on a literal level, that's, I guess, what it is. In Korea, when the film was shown at the Korean Film Festival, there was a scandal about this film there, but it was a different kind of scandal. The film was cut, and it was not supposed to be cut. And no one knew that it was cut until it was actually being screened, because of course, they wanted to gain credibility as an international film festival, and the one thing you cannot do if you want that is to cut films that are being shown in the festival. If you do that, you have no credibility. So here was this film, and suddenly many things were cut from it. And one of the things that was cut was that scene, because in Korean society, and I think actually in many Asian societies, sex with anybody who's physically disabled in any way is a total taboo. Now, whether that holds for what the person's husband or wife does with them at home alone, I don't know. But in public, it is just not acceptable. The idea that a disabled person, a cripple, could have any sexuality, could have the chance to express that sexuality is an absolute taboo. So that's why that was cut, for that particular reason. It's interesting, in North America, I've actually had support from this particular quarter of people who are disabled, love that character, because she's a woman who is not sexually destroyed, disintegrated by the fact that she's disabled. She, in fact, incorporates her new destroyed body into her sexuality and uses it as a kind of a new sexuality. And of course, that fits right in with what's happening to the other characters, that in the course of reinventing their sexuality, she's done that herself for her own reasons, and that's why they all work so well together.
We only have time for a few more questions and shorter answers, I suspect. Yes?
No way. Could you speak a little louder? I can't hear you.
There's a point where Ballard is trying to not really rationalise, but at least voice his own obsession.
Yes.
He says it's not really about a man-machine interface.
Yeah.
It's just the surface stuff. It's a lot deeper.
Yeah.
That's a point that seems to comment on the other point.
Yes, but you know, okay, this is Vaughn sort of, the first thing that Vaughn says is, when the Ballard character asks Vaughn, what is your project? What is this mysterious project that you're trying to involve us all in? He says it's how modern technology is the reshaping of the human body by modern technology. Of course, many of my own films are about that. And frankly, I can't remember whether that line is in the book or not, which is great, which is when you know that you've fused properly, because I can't tell which one of us wrote that. But I then have him later say that was just he doubles back on that, and he says that's not really what the project is. That's just a crude sci-fi concept that floats on the surface, doesn't disturb anybody. There I'm talking about my own prior films, you see. I think I did write that line. And he says, it's really about something else, and he goes on to explain, talking about the car crash as a fertilizing rather than a destructive event. That's from the book. But he isn't really making a moral comment. You see, what the comment here is that this guy, even as radical and crazed as Vaughn is, feels the need to make a moralizing comment on what he's doing. But he's not very good at it. And he keeps changing it, and he keeps forgetting what he said before. And I got that feeling very distinctly from the book as well, that Vaughn, you never quite find out what the project is. And the reason you don't is because he's fumbling for it as well. He's not a guru who has an incredibly well defined agenda. He's someone who is exploring and fumbling. And so I think that's really what that's all about, rather than not.
James, would you agree about the business, but you never really find out what his project is in the book? Or?
No, I think that's a fair point that David's just made. I think the book is open-ended. I mean, and I think the film is open-ended. It doesn't come down. It presents a terrain. I mean, I mean, it's discussing, something that's been happening, I don't know, at least 50 since the Second World War, which is a sort of, I don't know what you could call it, the sort of normalizing of the psychopathic. I mean, larger and larger areas of what used to be regarded as psychopathic and aberrant behavior have now been annexed into the sort of acceptable. Yeah. And this has, pluses and minuses, but I mean, we're much more tolerant on an everyday level of what seems to be, if not psychopathic, at least aberrant behavior. I mean, if you hear that, the woman next door has been charged and fined for shoplifting, your reaction isn't moral disapproval. It's probably a poor woman. She's been through a rough time recently. Her husband's having an affair. One feels sympathy. And this applies to, what areas of human behavior, particularly those involved with perverse sex, which are, my parents' generation would have regarded as absolutely within the realm of the psychopathic. I mean, we had a case here a couple of years ago where half a dozen SM devotees, all taking part in consensual sex with some very sinister equipment, hammers, nails, and planks of wood, were actually were arrested and charged with some offense under whatever statute. And I think they received short prison sentences. And there was a huge debate about this. Should people engaging in extreme forms of perverse sex that are no harm to anybody else be allowed to do so? Now, most people would regard the things that these people were doing as, well within the area of the psychopathic. Crash also, I mean, it's exploring that terrain where I assume the human race is heading.
Yeah, because I mean, I certainly was well aware of that making the movie, that the psychology of the characters was not normal, was not something, when people talk, this is another formal thing too. I mean, it's a sort of a basic tenet of Hollywood filmmaking that the audience must identify with the characters, and that's why you get in the story conferences, can't Vaughn be a little more sympathetic? Could he have a dog? Could he, and the answer is, well, no, maybe not, because these characters are familiar because of the way they look and the world that they live in, but the part that's unfamiliar is their psychology, which is, I thought that some people think of Crash as sci-fi, and I do feel that it does have a very strong futurist element, but the futurist element is this future psychology. The characters, it's as though Jim had taken a psychology that he sees being the standard psychology in 40 years and brings it back to the present, well, now the past. That's interesting. And it gives it to these characters who live in the present. And see what happens, once again, without saying that it's bad, that it's psychotic, that it should be, that's why the police are a very minor presence in the book and in the film, because the exercise is not to see what would happen realistically now if people did this, it's to allow them to do it unhindered, to see where it takes them psychologically. So that's why, to the great confusion of some newspaper writers, I think it's still legitimate to say that the movie is not to be taken literally or realistically, but is more metaphorically, and that's where the true response to the film will come.
I think maybe one more. What's the responsibility of that?
It's a heavy responsibility. I hope you're up to it.
Given your experience making the film and the subsequent criticisms and comments, do you still feel the same way about American Psycho, which I believe you were interested in making, or have you changed?
Well, no, American Psycho was something that I was interested in. First of all, I had read a lot about it, and then an American producer named Ed Pressman, who's made some very interesting films, sent me a note saying, I hear that you love this book, American Psycho, and I have the rights to it, and would you be interested? And I wrote him back saying, I've actually never read it. but I would be interested in reading it. He sent it to me. I thought it was a fantastic book. I also thought that despite everything that I read, I had not seen one description of the book that was remotely accurate, including the one by Norman Mailer that was sort of supporting it in some ways, which just shows you. I mean, it's the way that I feel most people who've only read about Crash will have no idea, none whatsoever, what the movie really will feel like when they're in it. The book was, I found mesmerizing and incredibly strange and put me in a very strange place, and I thought it was really very literary too, which not too many people say. I mean, it was well written. It was really well and with great love and attention to detail. And I did go through a couple of attempts to develop a script from it. One that Brett Ellis did himself, he's the writer of the book, and one that my friend Norman Snyder, who co-wrote Dead Ringers with me, tried. And I began to feel that I could not do that book. I couldn't find a way to replicate on screen the experience that I had reading the book. Whereas with Crash, I did. So when I started to write Crash, I had no idea that it would work. I was very prepared to say, at the end of some months of trying to write it, that it didn't work and that I couldn't figure out a way to do it. With American Psycho, even leaving aside the incredible hostility that there would be to the movie just because of the book, I didn't feel that I could find a way to make that work on the screen. That's really and that was the end of it.
I think we're going to have to stop because there's another movie coming here at 9 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming, and Ballard.